Welcome to ACP. I'm your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments of the most critical issues. Whether you're new to the topic or need a refresher, I hope you will join us in our exploration of everything related to arms control. In this season, we offer primers on all the nuclear weapons arsenals currently existing in the world and their relationship to arms control. I hope it helps you better know a nuke.
We have been able to destroy over 85% of our nuclear weapons since the Cold War with Russia. And that is a huge success in terms of disarmament.
Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, you can see arms control as a process of dialogue, discussion, sharing of information, learning about each other's forces over 50 or 60 years that on 8 occasions in that long time produced legally binding treaties.
The president, who wants the arms control agreement, often has to engage in some kind of side payment to others within the U.S. government in order to get their support for the arms control agreement. And often the side payment comes in more money and more forces.
In this episode, we will be looking at the United States of America. We will be guided by Amy Woolf, Professor Rebecca Davis Gibbons, and Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. They will share their perspectives on the historical development of the American nuclear weapons arsenal, the successes and failures of arms control in shaping this arsenal, and what the future might hold. To get us started, I asked our guests to talk about the dynamics that drove the nuclear arms race during the Cold War, and the role that arms control played in reducing the dangers that came from it. The conversation touches on the effect of extended nuclear deterrence on arms control, the state of arms control between the United States and Russia, the challenge of China, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons.
I'm Amy Woolf. I'm a longstanding specialist in nuclear weapons policy here in Washington. For most of my career, I worked at the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress as a specialist in nuclear weapons policy, where my area of focus and concentration was U.S. and Soviet, U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons, and particularly nuclear arms control process between the United States and Soviet Union, the United States and Russia. The United States nuclear arsenal was basically developed in 3 timeframes. The first is the early 1960s, when we first developed the 3 different legs of our nuclear triad: land-based ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers that were all equipped to carry nuclear warheads. At the time, we had a number of shorter-range delivery systems, most deployed in Europe and many in Asia, in the sense that they were seen as a way to deter and, if necessary, engage in a land war if it occurred. So we had the full scope of all ranges, all types, all delivery systems developed in the early and mid-1960s. Then come the late 70s, early 80s, and we had to start recapitalizing those. They're getting old. So we had what was known as the Reagan buildup. We built some of the existing land-based missiles, the Minuteman missiles that are still in U.S. silos, actually were first put there in the early 1970s. They've been refurbished several times. We built new land-based missiles, new submarines, new submarine-launched missiles, new air-delivered systems, bombers, cruise missiles, all of that during the 1980s. All those programs were in the budget before Reagan started throwing more money at them. Several of the programs, as they came to fruition, were either scaled back or delayed by the late 1980s and early 1990s, again, as the U.S.-Russian, U.S.-Soviet relationship changed. Normally, we would have expected another cycle of recapitalization as things got old 10, 15, 20 years later, which would have been 10, 15, 20 years ago. But we were at the time in the midst of a better relationship with the Soviet Union, budget constraints and all the rest, and we delayed many of the programs.
My name is Rebecca Davis Gibbons. I'm an associate professor of political science in the University of Southern Maine. I broadly look at nuclear issues in terms of nonproliferation and disarmament and arms control. So thinking about how humanity has grappled with reducing the risks of these weapons and this material. We saw both sides just go up, 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 up through the Cold War. Why did we get to a place where the U.S. had over 31,000 nuclear weapons in 1967? If we just think in terms of a rational perspective, military matching military, there are examples where the U.S. built up its arsenal because it was trying to match the Soviet Union. Early in the nuclear age, the US relied mainly on heavy bombers to deliver nuclear weapons. Because of its alliance relationships, it could have planes essentially encircle the Soviet Union. When the US realized that the Soviet Union was developing a program for intercontinental ballistic missiles, what we call ICBMs, that really spurred the US to develop this system. So we see this traditional security dilemma relationship where there's some desire to match capabilities. But there's a lot of other arguments. One that is really important when thinking about why the US had over 30,000 nuclear warheads in 1967 is to think about the inter-service rivalries that occurred within the US military. For example, the Air Force originally has control of nuclear weapons in terms of the bombers. They have the delivery platform for delivering nuclear weapons because they have the aircraft. In the Cold War, that gives them institutional power and prestige. The Navy resents this and in 1956 starts talking about building nuclear armed subs. So they also have play in this new world of nuclear weapons. And you even see arguments over nuclear strategy that come not necessarily from rational unitary actor thinking, what is the best strategy for us for nuclear weapons? You see services arguing for strategies consistent with their particular hardware. So counterforce arguments that you need really accurate weapons to take out the other side's nuclear weapons military installations. The Air Force likes counterforce because it has the most accurate way to deliver nuclear weapons in terms of bombers in the early nuclear age. Whereas the Navy says it doesn't really matter how accurate it is as long as you can deter because you have these large nuclear weapons that can respond. And so you see different strategies being taken on as it benefits the particular service. We also know that our targeting plans made for having more nuclear weapons than maybe we needed. There was a point during the Cold War where 700 weapons were targeted on Moscow alone. Depending on the guidance, you can have very different numbers of nuclear weapons needed. If the guidance says we need to have 97% confidence that we're going to destroy a certain capability, then you need to put more weapons on that target than if you say, an 80% confidence that we're going to destroy that capability. And so there was a point where we just had so many different targets at such high percentages of needing to be destroyed that increased the number of weapons that the U.S. needed.
Back to Amy Woolf.
The arms control process between the United States and Soviet Union and the United States and Russia actually began in the late 1950s with the Surprise Attack Conference, where the two sides got together to try and figure out how to prevent or understand or pay attention to what was going on with their force postures in ways that address their concerns about the potential for surprise attack. And the conference failed. They did not come up with any measures, but it was the first time they actually talked about what their nuclear force postures were and what they planned to do with them. They didn't have the same language to describe these things, so that kicked it off. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, you can see arms control as a process of dialogue, discussion, sharing of information, learning about each other's forces over 50 or 60 years that occasionally, on 8 occasions in that long time, produced legally binding treaties. And it was in that process that the two sides learned about their force postures, learned about their plans, their programs, shared their information. And for the first 15 years or so, until the mid-1980s, the agreements they came up with did not really reduce their nuclear weapons. They kind of bounded the size and purpose of their weapons. But unless they had already decided they wanted to limit their weapons, the agreements didn't do that. So in the SALT era, in the SALT I interim agreement, in the SALT II treaty, both sides were allowed to expand their forces. The ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, limited them to one site, but they'd already decided that that was what they wanted. The agreements gave them a chance to manage their competition and restrain their forces, but they weren't literally negotiating limit. In the 1980s, when that began to shift, it was because the U.S.-Russia and U.S.-Soviet relationship had changed. During the first Reagan administration, the United States was building up its forces, the Soviet Union was building up their forces, and we did not get a treaty limiting or reducing nuclear weapons. But in the late 1980s, we started to get several of them. When you ask people what changed, the first thing that comes to mind is Mikhail Gorbachev came in and was president of the Soviet Union. He wanted to reform the Soviet economy, but Ronald Reagan was in his second term, and he wanted to build a legacy on nuclear disarmament and nuclear arms control. The two of them together improved the U.S.-Russia and U.S.-Soviet relationship. As a result, the requirements for the numbers of nuclear weapons began to decline. In the late 1980s, Frank Miller from the Pentagon went out to Strategic Air Command and scrubbed the U.S. targeting plans, looked at U.S. doctrine, and came back and said, we can get by with around 6,000 nuclear warheads, when at the time we had about 10,000 to 12,000. And lo and behold, the START I Treaty, signed in 1991, had a limit of 6,000 warheads on it. So that's how it worked. We would determine our requirements, and when the relationship was improving and the requirements were dropping, the numbers in arms control treaties also came down. The treaties didn't require the reductions. The changes in requirements were codified in the treaties. But that's not all that the United States and Soviet Union, or the United States and Russia, did during that time frame, from the late 1950s through the early 2010s. They also tried other tools, or built up a toolbox of other capabilities to manage their competition and reduce the risk of nuclear war. My favorite example of this comes from the early 1970s, the Incidents at Sea Agreement. And at the time, the United States and Soviet Union were having a bit of a problem in the Mediterranean, where their ships would sometimes go bump in the night. You really don't want that to happen in the midst of a Cold War, because even if it's an accident, it can escalate out of control. So in this agreement, they established some rules of the road for operations to reduce the risk that the ships would go bump. And they set up communications channels in case there was an accident, so it wouldn't escalate. That's a classic risk reduction measure that has nothing to do with limiting weapons, but everything to do with managing the competition and reducing the risk of war. There are many other tools established over that time. Missile launch notification agreements, communication channels, lots of ways to think about, even if your numbers of nuclear weapons are going up, having steps taken to manage the competition in ways that reduce the risk that you'd have inadvertent escalation to a nuclear war.
Arms control is not only about the politics between countries that have nuclear weapons. There are difficult domestic politics to arms control agreements as well. Professor Rebecca Davis Gibbons explained why that is so and how that manifests in the United States.
Another contributing factor, I would argue, to the growth of the U.S. arsenal is arms control. When we think about arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, we talk about this in terms of two-level games. You have the level of the negotiators. They represent the diplomat from the U.S., the diplomat from the Soviet Union, meeting and hashing out some agreement. But they also have, at level 2, negotiations with the different factions they have in their own government. The president, who wants the arms control agreement, often has to engage in some kind of side payment to others within the U.S. government in order to get their support for the arms control agreement. And often the side payment comes in more money and more forces. Just to give you an example, with the 1972 Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, so we call that SALT I, that was divided into 2 agreements, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and an interim agreement to limit the number of submarine-launched and land-based missiles. Kissinger, to get the military, and particularly the Joint Chiefs, to agree to go along with these negotiations, at one point had to agree to the Navy's Trident system. So replacing Polaris missiles with Trident missiles, they received additional funding, and that helped them get on board to support these agreements that the Nixon administration worked on with the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that we wouldn't have Trident absent SALT, but they got more funding and quicker because the Nixon administration needed their support. We see this with SALT II, with the Carter administration needed to sign on to the MX missiles because he thought it would help get more support in Congress for ratification of SALT II. The MX missile was an experimental missile that eventually became the Peacekeeper. This was a MIRVed missile. MIRVed means it has multiple warheads that can be independently maneuvered. One missile could have 10 different warheads targeted at different targets. The Peacekeeper was a MIRV missile, and Carter didn't like it, but he signed off on it in 1979, hoping that it would boost the chances of ratification of this treaty. The U.S. government says that it has promoted nonproliferation is by its nuclear sharing agreements and its nuclear alliance relationships. So all of the countries that are under this so-called US nuclear umbrella are expected not to proliferate because they're protected by US nuclear weapons. For example, if we didn't have this commitment to Japan, or if we didn't have this commitment to South Korea, there's concern they would go nuclear. In the past, there's also been concerns about this happening in European countries. There are times where the US has gotten rid of weapons, and certain allies have been really upset because they thought of those weapons as being weapons that protected them.
For an illustration of how the U.S. policy of extended nuclear deterrence can complicate arms control matters, I asked Amy Woolf to talk about the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty.
Most of the public discussion about the INF Treaty is a bit ahistorical. You go back to 1979 and NATO's dual track decision to both deploy intermediate range missiles in Europe in response to Soviet intermediate range missiles. And then the second track was to negotiate a treaty to eliminate those missiles. And you can say, oh, look, we did that. We deployed in 1983 and we got a treaty in 1987. But that's not how it worked. The dual track decision was not really about eliminating intermediate range systems in Europe. It was about the fact that NATO didn't have any intermediate range systems. And as Helmut Schmidt, who was the Chancellor of Germany, said in a speech in 1977, the problem was that the United States and Soviet Union had strategic parity at the long-range systems level. And there was a concern in Europe that they would then be left on their own because we wouldn't want to engage and put our own self at risk. But the real problem for NATO countries was there was nothing that could launch from NATO territory into Russia, getting over the Warsaw Pact into Russia to counter Russian missiles that could launch from Russia into NATO territory. We had shorter range systems in Europe designed to slow a conventional Soviet attack with the Warsaw Pact. But basically, the line was we would have nuked Eastern Germany to save Western Germany. So there was a long-standing discussion about expanding the capabilities in NATO. There were also several governments of nations in NATO that didn't want to put these missiles in NATO, so we had a dual-track decision. The second track, the negotiating track, was not designed to bring Soviet Union to the table. It was designed to bring some of the NATO allies to the deployment. We promised them negotiations. However, the Reagan administration did come in and say, we got to put an arms control proposal on the table. Let's make it something we know the Soviets won't accept. So they proposed that we get rid of all the INF missiles. And surprise, surprise, the Soviets said no. We deployed the missiles. Then the mid-1980s happened. Gorbachev and Reagan wanted to change the world. Gorbachev came around over a series of speeches in 1985-86 to the idea that maybe we should eliminate all of these INF range missiles. And Reagan agreed, and they expanded it to a global elimination, not just a European elimination. In 1987, they signed the treaty that said, you will not only eliminate the missiles that can fly either on a ballistic trajectory or a cruise missile trajectory to less than 5,500 kilometers, you will eliminate all the ones you have and you will never build them again. Reporting has it the Soviet military was not thrilled about that, but Gorbachev really wanted to do it, both to build a relationship with the United States and to save money on building the weapons. And it went into force in 1988, and it was fine until about the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005. We noticed, and the Russians noticed, that China was building a lot of intermediate range missiles. The United States and Russia went to the UN with a proposal to globalize the INF Treaty to meet Russia's concerns about other countries on its periphery building these missiles. And other countries on the periphery, including China, said, thank you, no thank you. Apparently, the Russian military still didn't like this, so they decided to keep asking and eventually started developing intermediate range missiles again. The Rusbek, which has become the Oreshnik, and a cruise missile, which is now the 9M729, which the Russians claim can't fly to more than 500 kilometers. The United States disputed that, and that's what brought down the INF Treaty. The dispute over whether this new cruise missile, which Russia first tested in the late 2000s, had tested several times by 2013-14, even though the specific version on the specific launcher never tested to more than 500 kilometers, the United States believed that through intelligence sources, it was the same missile that they had tested in a test facility. The Russians have repeatedly said, no, it can't. We repeatedly said, yes, it can. And by 2017, 2018, we were at a standstill. Politically, it was untenable for the United States to stay in the treaty, and this concern about China was pushing the U.S. policy community to think maybe we want more land-based missiles too. So the Trump administration pulled out of the treaty. At the time, President Putin said, we're going to pull out of the treaty too, but we promise we won't deploy any INF range missiles in European territory or any region of the world until the United States and NATO do it first. And we should negotiate on this moratorium. There are a lot of people who think that was an opportunity lost by the United States, that it did not negotiate on this with Putin. But there were two problems. The first was we wanted intermediate range missiles for the Indo-Pacific and maybe for Europe. So again, if your requirements say you need the weapon, you're not going to negotiate a treaty that says you can't have it. On the other hand, there was every evidence to many in the U.S. policy community that Putin's proposal for the moratorium was less than realistic and somewhat cynical. First, Russia already had the 9M729, and even though Putin said he wouldn't move that into range of Europe, i.e. 500 kilometers, we already believed it could fly much further than that. Second, the proposal was we will have a moratorium and negotiate something formal. This sounded a lot like the early 1980s INF negotiations, where the Soviet Union already had SS-20s, and the negotiations from the Soviet side, this was their proposal, we won't deploy any more and you won't deploy any more, so we get our few hundred and you get zero. And this sounds a lot like that. You'll have lengthy negotiations while Russia continues to deploy the 9M729, that it has air-delivered systems, that it now has the Oreshnik, and NATO won't deploy anything and the United States won't move anything into Europe because we're in the midst of a negotiation. So it sounded a bit cynical as a way to freeze things where they were, and it also was not tenable politically or geopolitically for the United States to accept a moratorium on the development and deployment of these systems. So where we are right now, unfortunately, is on the verge of a Europe bristling with intermediate range missiles because the United States has agreed with Germany to begin rotating them through. And the Russians have plenty of intermediate range and shorter missiles that can reach Europe. There are two reasons why we are not negotiating a follow-on agreement to New START with the Russians right now. The first is the Russians have said, in spite of many American efforts to bring them back to the table, no thank you. They have said specifically and repeatedly, as long as the United States and NATO continue to support Ukraine, there will be no return to the arms control negotiations. That may be a miscalculation, but they are attempting to leverage what they see as U.S. greater support for arms control as a way to break the United States off of its support for Ukraine. The second reason there should be skepticism about negotiating a follow-on treaty is that the United States has made it clear in several executive level speeches over the last couple of years that it might need more nuclear weapons deployed in the strategic forces, non-strategic nuclear weapons in the coming years because we now face two nuclear peers, two challengers. And it's not a one-for-one or an arithmetic computation where, we now have two peers and one of them has X number of targets, so we need X times 2 number of more warheads, or we need more warheads than both combined. It's not arithmetic. But it is that kind of targeting requirement issue that allowed us to bring our forces down in the 1980s as the requirements dropped. If that's turning around, then we may need more warheads. That doesn't mean we can't negotiate a treaty with the Russians. It just means if we do so, the odds of the number of warheads allowed by the treaty going down is close to zero. You could still manage the competition and demonstrate restraint with a higher limit, acknowledging that both sides want to know what's going on with the other side, but their requirements say we need more warheads. There is the prospect, if we do ever sit back down at the table, if the Russians do come back to the table, or the United States decides it will help resolve the Ukraine conflict so that we can get back to the table, that we would have something looking like a formal treaty, but the numbers may not be going down. In this environment, it is even more important that the two sides recognize if we have the same issues going on with China and in the Indo-Pacific, where forces are operating in close proximity, where there's regional challenges, and where a conflict, if it were to break out, would start as a regional conflict but have the risk of escalating because there are nuclear powers getting engaged. So in both cases, there is room for operational restraints, notifications, Missile launch notifications are always a great example. When they're tested, you don't want the other side to believe you're about to launch a war, so you announce your test in advance. And the United States did hold one series of risk reduction discussions with China late in 2023. And then the Chinese said, thank you, no thank you, we're not interested in moving forward. But keeping the channels of communication open about these issues is the first and most important step. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to do that if all the parties involved agree that the risk of nuclear war is worth managing. Unfortunately, we can't be sure of that right now. We, the United States, are somewhat risk averse, and we want to manipulate and manage that risk and lower it. But in several examples, both in the conflict in Ukraine and in Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, you have countries that may be more interested in accepting risk, if not actually seeking it, as a way to use a coercive tool to convince the United States and NATO not to get involved. Right now, we are in the next phase of recapitalization. This is not an arms race. This is not based on the nature of the U.S.-Russian or U.S.-Chinese relationship. If you want to maintain the force posture that you have, you need to recapitalize the old stuff and build new stuff. So that's what we're doing. New submarines, refurbished submarine-launched ballistic missiles, new land-based ballistic missiles, new bombers, and new delivery systems, new bombs, cruise missiles. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, we pulled many of our shorter range systems out of Europe and Asia because the world had changed. It was something called the Presidential Nuclear Initiatives in 1991, where the president said, we don't need this anymore. We're going to pull this stuff out. Now there is a reconsideration of whether we need more of those types of regional systems. So the Biden administration actually added to the U.S. wish list during the first Trump administration is a new sea-launched nuclear armed cruise missile, which could be deployed in region on submarines or surface ships. The nature of the geopolitics, its age. But the geopolitics are leading to an expansion of the types of systems we think we might need, particularly regionally, and the numbers of warheads we might need to put out there on the deployed systems in the next 5, 10, 15 years. That's where we're going. When you do the arithmetic on how many warheads we might need in the future, that is the two-peer competitor issue. Again, it's not simple arithmetic. It's not, twice as many peers, twice as many warheads. It's a more complex mathematical calculation. What are the targets? What are our destruction requirements? And it's not because we're planning to fight a nuclear war, but if U.S. doctrine says the way to deter a nuclear war is to maintain the capability to convince the adversary that they could not benefit from initiating the conflict. So we need to be able, we believe, it's not my belief, this is U.S. government, to be able to hold at risk that what the adversary values. Hold at risk is not arithmetic. It's let them believe that if things go bad, the United States has the ability to threaten and, if necessary, destroy these targets. So if there are two countries and more targets that we need to hold at risk, there is the calculation that we need more warheads. That may change the nature of some of the ongoing modernization programs, like do we need more submarines? We're planning on having 12 of the new submarines. Do we need more? Interesting question, but it's a decision we don't have to make until another 10 or 15 years from now, because we're already building them as quickly as our infrastructure allows. So it would be at the end of the program. But that definitely is something that the Navy, that the Pentagon would have to start planning into the budget process if they think they may want to get there later. Things like the new sea-launched nuclear armed cruise missile, one could directly argue it's due to the geopolitics in both Asia and Europe. When the Trump administration first proposed it in 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, the vision was more about Europe. We were already through the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Russia was menacing other parts of Ukraine. The idea that we might need something more visible, more regional, more local, both to engage our allies and reassure them and to deter the Russians, was part of the argument in favor of the new sea-launched cruise missile. When the United States withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 2018, China's missiles, China's growing nuclear force posture, were a significant piece of that debate. So the presence of China's challenge has been affecting U.S. thinking on force posture at least since 2017, 2018. And you can't say it's not a factor now. The center of gravity has shifted in the United States on whether or not we can continue to build down our forces or we need to maintain the capability to increase our forces. And quite definitely over the last 3 or 4 years through the Biden administration. When the administration started, there was expectation in much of the community that we'd continue to negotiate with the Russians and bring numbers down.
Our third guest has an inside perspective on the Biden administration's arms control efforts.
My name is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. I served as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. Department of State from 2021 to 2024. Prior to that, I served in the Obama administration as the coordinator for threat reduction programs. And in that role, I focused on security issues of weapons of mass destruction and really more on non-state actors rather than state actions. People ask, what's the future of arms control? If you're talking about traditional arms control treaties, there certainly is a limitation because of the geopolitical situation that exists right now. But if there's a recognition of what arms control does, beyond just being a legal document, but what it provides, then I think it opens up a wider aperture in understanding the role of arms control writ large today. So I think that's the lens that we have to look at in terms of where we are and what we can do in the future. The Biden administration came in, and one of the first things that the administration did was to extend the New START treaty that we have with Russia, the last bilateral treaty we have with them on these issues. Russia, of course, was in agreement with that, and it was a part that was already in the treaty that it could be extended. The next effort would have been to see how further we could get in these START treaties we've had with Russia for so many years to continue to reduce nuclear weapons. We started okay with Russia. We had a couple of meetings with them in 2021 toward the end of the year. Once they invaded Ukraine, that pretty much put everything on hold. A couple of things that Russia did was to stop the inspections in the treaty between the two countries and also to stop meeting with the U.S. We have in the treaty, we're supposed to meet with them twice a year. And so they stopped doing that. In response, the U.S. took what we call legal countermeasures, where we said, essentially, if you're not going to do that, we're not going to do that. However, we still abide by the amendments of the treaty, and so does Russia. Even though they're in violation of provisions of the treaty, and we say that very clearly, they're still within the numbers that are limited by the treaty. So one of the biggest things that is happening right now for this new administration is what we're going to do about that. At the end of the Biden administration, we made it very clear that we were ready to meet with them on these issues. We were ready to talk with them about not just fully implementing New START, but getting back to the table to talk about the future of another START treaty, which expires in February 2026. And we only had 2 meetings with them. The first one was getting acquainted, a lot of talking points, a lot of the typical, you do this kind of thing. But it was a necessary first start. The second meeting was good because we got to the point where we set up a couple of working groups. I think we all had in our minds something beyond New START. But beyond that, we just put things out. Our issue was tactical nuclear weapons. That's something we really wanted on the table. They didn't want it as much. They wanted missile defense, and we didn't want it as much. So those were like the 2 things that we had to put on. We had things like emerging technologies and space issues. We had put a number of things on the table that we could talk about, which I thought was positive. But of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and they were aware that was obviously going to create complications. But I want to make it very clear, at the end, we made it very clear to Russia that we were ready to come back to the table, and they refused. Another issue, obviously, is China and a PRC. Throughout the time I was Undersecretary, one of the things we really wanted to do was to start some type of dialogue with the PRC regarding their increased interest and buildup of their nuclear weapons complex. We knew that we were not going to get China to the table to talk about arms control because they were actually building. And so, for whatever reason they're doing that, we were realistic in knowing that they were to continue to have any conversations about control. We went into the discussion saying, we know arms control is not at the table on some of increasing your nuclear weapons. And we know that your country for many years felt that you had enough to respond to any kind of an attack. All of a sudden now you're just building up more weapons. So we wanted to have a discussion to try to prevent misinterpretation, to make sure we are very clear about what they're doing so we don't misinterpret and have accidental use of weapons. So we did have one real discussion with that on that issue. but nothing progressed beyond that. And even that was just a first meeting. So that's what I would call a more official exchange with them on these issues. Of course, we meet with them bilaterally if we're both in the same country for certain meetings. It wasn't like we weren't talking with them. It goes to the whole TPNW discussion, which the U.S., I would say the U.K. and France. I can't speak for Russia and China because one is nuclear saber rattling and the other one is not really going in the direction of disarmament. Countries that would like us to get rid of weapons tomorrow, it's just not going to happen. It's this gradual way of doing it, which has been successful, and hopefully we can get back to the table. Putting all 5 in the same category does not help. One of the challenges for them is the fact that there's 2 countries who are authoritarian regimes that don't really have a lot of respect for NGOs, right? And the ones that do, like the U.S., we listen. There are times when we come to the same agreements. There are times when we don't. When we respect non-governmental organizations, we respect the different viewpoints. We want to hear the different viewpoints. I've been in the NGO myself. I started my own NGO. So we hear and we listen. The other 2 certainly do not. It's not a criticism of the goal, because we have the same goal. We want the same things. At least majority of us do. But it's how you get there. And you're not going to get there if you don't recognize that you have to be critical of those countries that are going the opposite direction. On U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, that is one area where countries have been very supportive. As much as countries are not happy with Russia, they've always been supportive of us meeting with the Russians and continuing with New START, mainly because it's the way in which we have been able to destroy over 85% of our nuclear weapons since the Cold War with Russia. And that is a huge success in terms of disarmament. In this geopolitical environment, a lot of things are challenged, not just arms control. But we have successes. Chemical weapons has had a lot of successes. All countries destroyed other than declared chemical weapons. But we still have issues with Russia and Syria we gotta fix. Also has a lot of success, though we need to have an inspection regime. We have a lot of countries that are states parties to all 3 of those treaties. We have a lot of countries that are part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have the same states who we've been worried about for years, or the same states we're worried about now. We as an international community recognize the importance of norms and the challenges that emerging technologies pose to us. We at least realize we need to do something. That may not be what we've done before, but we certainly need to not wait for emerging technologies to be developed. We recognize there's other things like UAVs that we have to deal with. We recognize that we have to strengthen our export controls to deal with these new type of things. I would love to say that we didn't have to start worried about nuclear weapons in space. Now we just got new challenges. The most important thing is that we recognize that we have to use different methods and different multilateral entities to try to achieve what we need to achieve. And we need to keep talking with countries.
Thank you for listening, and to our guests and the European Union's Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding the series. Until next time, stay optimistic.